We don't have to begin talking about Kant. We don't have to. We've already begun talking about Kant, so maybe we do have to because it's already happened. We don't have to finish talking about Kant, but I think maybe we want to. Corinne asked an interesting question at the end of our last class, which was when is stuff going to look normal again? By the end of our last class, we had gotten to experience at least, which is pretty normal. I don't know if anything like is ever really completely normal after you get through Kant's big subjective turn. This Copernican revolution that he's talking about is like a big enough deal that things don't really ever look normal again after this. For my part, at least, I can kind of trace my own philosophical thinking as like there was definitely a before Kant and after Kant phase. That like I did not think about things the same way after I read Kant and began to understand him. How do we usually start this? Just a whole bunch of slogans? What are they again? What's Kant up to in this business of the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics? What kind of questions is he trying to answer? He's trying to offer a genuine response to Hume. In what way? Yeah, Corbin?
How is metaphysics?
Yeah, how is metaphysics possible? And that's where we are today. Section 3, the possibility of metaphysics. And along for the ride came natural science and pure mathematics. And we've already discussed those things. They both got the check, at least. I think sections 1 and section 2, perhaps at least leaving us feeling like Kant has offered up an account of how it is that pure mathematics is possible. Actually looks a little bit different than maybe some of us were assuming pure mathematics was. How natural science is possible in some way that there could be a pure natural science, and that natural science could be grounded and not just kind of floating free. This is a big part of the response to the Humean criticism. The skeptical criticism in section 4 of Hume's Enquiry. And now we're back up to this question of whether or not metaphysics is possible. The key to this lies, by the way, in what's the little mechanism? What's the thing that Kant is on the lookout for that Hume said was not possible? Yeah, synthetic a priori. So this is all about synthetic a priori knowledge. And depending on how things go today, we might start talking about, like, what exactly counts as knowledge? And is, like, the stuff that Kant is talking about that metaphysics produces, is that knowledge? Or is it something that, like, maybe knowledge, like, stops at natural science? What else is in the mix here?
Soul bit about the soul.
What bit about the soul?
Doesn't he talk about the soul in this one?
Oh, he does talk about the soul in this one. I'm still like, what's my like collection of slogan stuff? We mentioned Copernican revolution, maybe something like that. Copernican revolution. I just mentioned the phrase subjective turn, Kant's subjective turn. Basically, this comes down to an idea that we've expressed at other meetings about how objects of experience for Kant, or at least under this Kantian system, or this Kantian picture of how cognition works, how knowledge is produced. For Kant, objects of cognition conform to the necessary structures of thought. It's not the other way around. How people used to think about it, the geocentric way of thinking about it, was that our thoughts conform to external objects, to the things in themselves. And this is how you get thoughts that kind of resemble those external objects. And when your thoughts resemble the external world sufficiently enough, we say that, like, you've got an idea that's true and you have knowledge of the world, right? So that's a model where your thoughts conform to the objects, to the things in themselves. And Kant is saying, no. According to this subjective turn, according to this Copernican revolution, where we're going to cut the noumena loose and say, like, forget about the things in themselves. Now we're going to start talking about objects of thought necessarily conforming to the necessary structures of thinking itself. So we can see why we call this a subjective turn. A subjective turn, it moves the objects from out there to in here, something that's like part of the constitution of experience. Jack, did you have your hand up, or is that just how you're sitting?
I think you already heard it. I was going to say one of the phrases is the things in themselves because they're
Yeah, the things in the, yeah, so we want to remember that phrase, the things in themselves, right? And I'll draw the picture in just a second. It's going to be a little bit different this time. I think we've also been playing around with this, and I'm going to stick with not going into much detail on this. I'll gesture towards it, because it's still a question on the exam. This notion that Kant refers to himself as an empirical realist and a transcendental idealist. So we'll definitely be in a position to begin talking about that today. And maybe we'll gesture towards it. I'm definitely not going to go into it in great detail. Okay, so previously when we draw this picture of cognition, the this is your brain on Kant picture, this kind of like map scheme, I've been putting, like a tree or a little dandelion or not a dandelion, a daffodil. Yeah, I've been doing a daffodil out here. Let's stop doing that because it's bad, right? It's false. It's completely contrary to like how Kant is trying to get us to think. So let's stop doing it. There's the noumena, and who the heck knows what's out there? And this is still going to be a little bit of a convention because, like, I have to kind of represent the beginning of the thinking subject. Oh, that's terrible. Beginning of the thinking subject's mind. There we go. So something like that is interacting with the noumena somehow, like maybe blah, blah, blah. And then we've been talking about, like, and then things come through the eye, and then there's, like, the first stage of the constitution of experience. But I don't know what's going on here, too. Like all of this up until this point is like a complete mystery, right? Phenomena starts here and kind of goes on afterwards, right? Everything before this, in fact, we might say there is no before this, because one of the things that comes on the scene here is the ordering of outer sense according to space and the ordering of inner sense according to time. There is no before, there's before. There's no before, right? Does that make sense? There's no before, and after, right? You can't even talk about before and after until you have space and time. This is sensation. This is the faculty of sensation. And in here we have empirical intuitions, which are just kind of like raw sense data that's been configured and organized according to our pure intuitions. And our pure intuitions are, I just mentioned them, space and time. Pure intuitions are space and time. And out of sensation comes perception. Now perception has happened. And we've talked about how, like, at this stage, what we have is determinable but not yet determinate, right? It's the kind of thing that can be made sense of, but no sense has been made of it just yet. This is the first phase of the constitution of experience. It's the passive aspect of the constitution of experience. It's the way that we bring things in and give our mind something to think with, right? This is the production, or the kind of like feeding the mind the raw materials that it uses to think with. Our next stage of this wasn't sensation. What do we call this faculty of the mind? Ooh, that was, concepts are what part of what happens here, but what do we call the faculty? It starts with a U. Yeah, this is the understanding. And sometimes Kant refers to its activity as thinking. Occasionally he'll refer to it as judgment. Judgments get produced. So the act of judgment can be thought of as like the activity of the understanding. And in here we have concepts. We have empirical concepts. And in addition to those empirical concepts, we have a collection of pure concepts of the understanding as well. Those pure concepts, how many of them were there that Kant identified? 12, yeah. And they were organized. We didn't get into talking about it too much, but there was this quantity, quality, relation, and modality division. And the way that Kant arrives at these is he recognizes that these are kind of like four necessary aspects of any kind of judgment. And starting with a table of judgments, where he looks at like how are the different ways that you could make a judgment, that any judgment could be possible at all. Because remember, like all of this, like anytime I'm talking about pure intuitions, pure concepts, all of this stuff is like reaching for synthetic a priori, right? It's looking at trying to figure out what are the necessary conditions for experience in the first place. And he says, like, okay, well, if there are going to be judgments, there are only so many ways that judgments can be made. There's an aspect of quantity to each. There's an aspect of quality to each. There's an aspect of relation to each, relating the subject and predicate to one another. And there's an aspect of modality in which we determine whether we're talking about things that are necessary or things that are contingent, etc. And within each of these, Kant identifies three possible concepts that can be employed to talk about the quantity, quality, relation, or modality of a judgment. And so we get, these 12 pure concepts of the understanding. Not 121, 12 pure concepts of the understanding. And these are synthetic a priori. These are things that apparently have to be present. Those sorts of concepts need to be available if any experience is going to happen at all. We can have other concepts. We can have concepts that are derived from empirical experience, and then I can kind of cycle back into any particular empirical experience. Concepts like red, concepts like rectangle, concepts like cat, concepts like calico cat. You can make them narrower, you can make them wider. How it is that like we devise these concepts is going to be contingent on the sorts of experiences that we have, except these 12. These 12 are necessary for any possible experience. How are we doing so far? Are we getting close to normal? Because at this point we have experience. And these two aspects of the mind are what are known as... maybe I want to go outside of phenomena there. Out of these, we get experience. And only after those two things do we get experience. And Kant refers to this as a discursive sort of a constitution. He says that these two faculties of the mind, the faculty of sensation and the understanding, these play a constitutive role. These are responsible for the constitution of experience. And that fact that we're talking about experience as an accomplishment, as something that is constituted, not that is just kind of had. There's a passive aspect to experience. That's intuition. Intuition concerns the passive aspects of experience. But then there's an active there's this kind of subsuming intuitions under concepts such that we can start to organize it and make sense of it. And then I have an experience of some particular thing. I not only have experience, but I have objects of experience. In order to have an experience, there must be some sorts of objects for my experience. I have to have experience of things. Role in experience. Experience can't happen without them lending a hand, playing some sort of role. Of intuition, the understanding, in which intuitions are subsumed under concepts and organized, made sense of, carved up, we might say. This is a way that we've been talking about it. Think of the world in its kind of like the world as it exists as the things in themselves, maybe, as something that hasn't been carved up. It takes a mind to carve the world up. And this is part of what happens in the understanding. When we start subsuming intuitions under concepts, we start saying, this is a thing, and cutting it out from its background and separating it from other things. Okay. Good so far? This is a great time to ask questions if you have any still. Because we're going to move on to something else, another faculty, and it's not in line with these others. Like something different is happening now. This concerns the operations and the characteristics of, not reason, the faculty of reason. Yes?
So under the 12 pure concepts, there are 3 that belong to each category?
Yeah, there are three that belong to each category, and I think not category, I don't want to use that word just because that's got some baggage. But yeah, there are these four aspects of any judgment that then become like these four kind of families of concepts, of like pure concepts, and each of them has three different variations on it. And I think as I mentioned at our last meeting, the first two of those three are usually pretty obvious, and the third one's always a little bit of a wild card. So for example, for the table of judgments under quantity, Kant says you can have universal judgments, you can have particular judgments, you can have singular judgments. That singular one is like the weird one. And he says, okay, for those kinds of judgments, there are three concepts that go along with that also have to do with that also concern quantity. And those are the concepts of unity, which he says that's how you get measure. All measure requires a unit, right? So that's going to be unity, plurality, and totality. Does it work? Like, does he like this transcendental deduction of like these categories? Does it, or these concepts, these 12 pure concepts of the understanding? Does it work perfectly? This requires an engagement with Kant that we are not prepared to get into. It's also not the sort of thing that's hashed out in the Prolegomena. It's the sort of thing that's hashed out in the Critique of Pure Reason. My sense is that few Kant scholars today really care about, like, did he get it exactly right, like, at the level of these sorts of details? They're more concerned with the big picture. In fact, we're going to see something kind of like that today when we start talking about reason. That there's something going on, like he's saying something, and if we can keep our eyes on the big picture, it makes sense. The details might be a little bit funny. We might take issue with them. And in fact, some of Kant's successors did exactly that. They put little spins on the things that he was talking about. Anything else before we start getting into talking about reason? Okay, the weird thing about reason is that nobody's really sure what it does. Well, we can start just by kind of putting a big question mark. And it's not a moment in this constitution of experience either. It seems to play a radically different sort of a role than either sensation or the understanding do. And one of the things that reason does do, when it works well, or at least, remember, this is when we're talking about a critique of pure reason is the parallel story that Kant is telling in a different publication here. So a critique of like how reason gets used in its pure form is exactly what he's got his sights set on. So Kant is going to be giving us an account of reason that kind of backs up and justifies a lot of the stuff that he was saying about experience. As a matter of fact, we'll notice there were some things that we glossed over when we were talking about the activities of the understanding and how experience is produced and how we get objects of experience. There were some things that we glossed over there that really telling the full tale of how that works requires the application of reason to experience. So we know that at least part of what reason does is that it works on experience. It doesn't work on sense data, it doesn't work on intuitions, it doesn't work directly on concepts, it works on experience. And part of what motivates reason, and I think this is like maybe one of the big clues that Kant drops in a surprisingly clear way for such a difficult and sort of muddy concept here, is Kant gets at the idea that reason's motivation seeks the completion of experience. It seeks to make experience complete. Or maybe another way of talking about it is it seeks a unity of experience. So, for example, if we were wondering, like, all right, so we're going to come up with empirical concepts here depending on what sorts of experiences we have. We might decide to carve up the world in different sorts of ways. What determines which concepts we use, which empirical concepts? How come we have, like, this set of concepts that we have and not a completely different one? I think I even mentioned Nelson Goodman's new riddle of induction at one point when I was talking about maybe we carve our color concepts up into grue and bleen instead of blue and green, right? So how can we get one set of concepts versus another set of concepts? How can we carve the world up one way rather than some other way? How is it that, and we might even think about it this way, how is it that natural science doesn't just start like noticing patterns in the world? How is it that it kind of progresses? That like as more science gets done, the theories get better and better and better. Is science actually moving towards anything? This would be a big aspect of trying to talk about it as some sort of grounded intellectual enterprise. So reason is seeking some sort of like, it's a motivation that seeks the completeness or the unity of experience, and we feed that back onto experience, and this enables us to kind of like reorganize our concepts a little bit. One of the things that reason does when it gets applied to experience is reason tries to, we might think about it this way, helps us pare down concepts to a bare minimum sort of a number. Minimum. If you have too many concepts, reason might say, like, I want experience to be a unity, not like so many different things. Like if I just see, if I've carved up my experience, I've carved up the manifold of intuition into lots of different objects, and maybe it's too complicated, too difficult to keep track of. Reason, this kind of motivation to see completeness and unity in my experience, is going to say, like, instead of a lot of different things, how about this is all just one thing? Let's have one concept to treat this whole thing instead of a whole bunch of different concepts that all seem to be floating around together. Does that seem like a reasonable sort of move that a mind might make? Yeah, so does this seem like the sort of thing that one's mind does do? David Hume talked about this as the sort of things that minds do, but says it's just a function of custom and habit. Maybe Immanuel Kant's not saying something too totally different. He's saying we have this faculty of reason, and this is what it does. And if somebody's like, why does it do that? He's just, that's just what it does. And one of the ways that we might answer that, like, why does it do what it does? And I don't know if this is a satisfactory way to answer that why question. But the same way that Kant would answer like any sort of question like that, which is because thinking would not be possible if there wasn't something like this. This kind of movement towards even coalescing things into objects seems to be informed a little bit by the activity of reason on experience, by saying, like, stop thinking about this as just a bundle of perceptions, a subjective experience. Make it an object that's going to be an object for all possible future subjective experiences. Make it an object that's going to be an object of possible experience for not just me, but for any possible subject who might come and look at this. This sort of unity is what making objects is all about. And it's a big part of what happens here in the understanding, but we don't really get a sense of how that part works just by looking at the understanding, because it's a function of reason influencing the understanding. Performing not a constitutive role, but what's known as a regulative role. The regulative role that reason plays with respect to experience is by making experience as complete as possible or as unified as possible. You might even say as simple as possible. It's kind of bringing the unity back together whenever you can, after having carved the world up into lots of separate things. How are we so far there? Does that part make sense? Because that's like the tame, normal activity of reason. This is reason's empirical activity. Its regulative role with respect to empirical experience. Yeah, Corbin.
Could you elaborate on why reason is necessary for us to be able to think?
I could try, but I'll confess I'm a little weak on this. Because it seems like maybe like at this point we have experience, so maybe we've got thinking already too, right? The question is going to be like whether this is going to count as thought. Well, it seems like, yeah, there is thinking, and that's what the understanding does. Maybe it also has to do with like whether or not we think that everything that's been described in this process so far can be something that can come out of just the elements that we've discussed in sensation and in the understanding. Just the activities of like intuitions being subsumed under concepts. And one of the tricky spots of this is this notion of an objective experience. Another thing that we started to get into, in fact, I might have even wrote it on the board at our last meeting, and in retrospect, that was way too early to introduce these sorts of things. But talking about a transcendental subject or a transcendental object that helps us to begin to like unify experience underneath sort of like one thing, and maybe even to go beyond like just doing it once for one thing, but to like keep doing it and saying, this was all one thing. It was all one day, right? I had like, what is a day? A day is like a collection of moments, right? What gets you to put it all together and call it one thing? And it seems like a big part of this is the activity of reason. And if we don't have this, then at the very least, thinking is going to look kind of peculiar. It's not going to look like the way that Corinne said it. Like, when is this going to start to look normal? Where we were at the end of our last class wasn't really quite normal thought. And it maybe leaves things off about where David Hume left them as well. Maybe we've got a description of what's going on that's not all that different than what Hume is talking about. And maybe metaphysics isn't possible either. We've made pure mathematics possible. We've made natural science possible. And maybe those things are possible just through the activities of sensation and the understanding in the phenomenal constitution of experience. But then there's this thing, which it seems that humans can do. Can only humans do it? Hell, can all humans do it? Have access to reason. Kant is not has no shortage of philosophical company here, by the way, in supposing it like, oh, you know what's like the most important, the crown jewel in every mind, and what sets humans apart from everybody else, and like makes us special? It's reason. That's what every philosopher ends up saying at the end of the day. Like, reason is just unbelievably important. And Kant is no exception to this. But so far we've only seen this kind of role that it plays with respect to experience, and it can help sort of flesh out, I think, the constitution of experience to make it look a little bit more normal. The real tricks that have to do with reason concern pure reason. Reason when it's not working on experience. Reason when reason has no objects of experience that it's kind of aiming its attention towards. What happens when reason turns itself in and looks at itself and tries to just reason about the things that reason produces? What happens then? That's the whole rest of today's lesson. Yeah, Will.
Right, so I think now I don't know reason.
Okay, good. Yeah, this is the cycle, the Kantian cycle, right? Is I know what it is, and then I learn more, and then I don't anymore. Yeah.
Because I thought that, like, why would he say that, like, only humans can reason? Because I thought that, like, you know, like, a dog is, like, looking outside, and you can, like, realize it's day without having, like, the cluttered mind is, like, okay, it's lighter than it was earlier.
Yeah, so we might say that, like, and we might take issue with some of the stuff that Kant has to say about, like, reason and whether it only belongs to humans, whether we're exceptionalists about reason. We might also recognize that maybe what we're really concerned with here is this question of pure reason, and maybe that's more plausibly only available to humans. But I think it's a stretch to say that Kant thinks that other sorts of creatures have reason, they just use it in a slightly different way, or they don't use it on itself, or they don't use it in some way that's detached from any kind of empirical content. I think he's got a tough case to make there, though, right? Because we might look at the sorts of experiences that non-human animals seem to have, and we might wonder to ourselves, like, some sort of faculty of reason needs to be at work there. We're not necessarily going to think that, like, dogs are going to they're not going to do logic, right? So Kant talks about, like, syllogistic logic, by the way. If you're kind of curious what pure reason looks like, syllogistic logic is a pretty good example of reason just kind of working all on its own. There's also this question of, like, the application of universal rules. Either the spinning out of, like, hypothetical consequences of some scenario in light of universal rules, which would be just kind of applying universal rules towards no object in particular, or we could then kind of apply that back on to experience and the objects of experience and come up with universal rules and try to apply those universal rules to our experience to see how well it all coheres together. Is it kind of all hanging together as a plausible experience of, like, one world, right? That the world is one thing and it's a certain way, whether I'm thinking of it or not, whether I'm experiencing it or not. And in those rare moments when I, like, make an object of experience, and then I kind of, like, walk away from it and I come back and it's completely different. It's no longer a blue marker. Now it's a green parakeet. Like, I've got some explaining to do. There should be, like, an itch of curiosity. There should be something that's like, hold on, wait a minute. How come blue marker turned into green parakeet? And now I have to come up with some account that kind of grants some unity to this surprising diversity of experiences. Does that make sense? Anytime you've had like some kind of like pesky, like, that was surprising, I was not expecting this demands an explanation. That was reason saying, like, we got to make some unity of this experience. We got to make some completeness of this experience, too. We can think of it in terms of this way that you get drawn into, like, wanting to see more. So here's marker. That's, like, maybe an incomplete experience, though. You might want to walk all the way around it to see all sides in order to have a more complete experience. I'm trying to unify those different profiles under one thing. And this is a big part of making objects of experience in the first place, but it's also the sort of thing that's driven by reason's desire to seek completion or unity in experience. Does it have to be like that? I think Kant is saying, yeah, it does have to be. Like, if there's going to be any kind of experience, if there's going to be thought, if there's going to be, we can start here, if there's going to be metaphysics, then yeah, it's going to have to be like that. There can't be any metaphysics without reason. There might be able to be reason without metaphysics. This doesn't seem metaphysical. This is just good theoretical science. Maybe this is philosophy of science too. It's kind of standing back and looking at experiences and saying, like, I think we can organize our concepts in a more spare, in a more streamlined, in a more economical, in a simpler way. If you've ever heard of this principle of parsimony when it comes to explanations, or Occam's razor is another name for this. This idea that the simplest explanation is, all other things being equal, usually the best explanation. This is the same sort of thing, right? Try to get things as simple as possible. This is something that reason drives us towards. And it helps us make more sense of our experience. It helps make the way that we make sense of our experience more uniform, easier to share with other subjects, more likely to kind of like do more explanatory work with our theories too, come up with concepts that'll work in more cases than just like one or two, concepts that'll work in multiple cases. You'll have better, more fruitful sorts of concepts then. And you'll be organizing the world in a way that seems like it has a more coherence to it. It's less fragmented. It's starting to become the sort of thing that you could plausibly put forward as like, there is just one world, and it's the same world for everybody. Trouble is, it can't be this, though, right? Can't be the noumena. So what's that going to end up looking like? Well, it's these. It's the concepts, right? It's the objects of experience. These objects of experience that are phenomenal objects, not noumenal objects. And that's absolutely crucial to understanding Kant's subjective term. All right. Any more questions about reason in its empirical applications on experience? Yeah.
All right. When you say application of universal rules, are you referring to space and time?
No, I am not referring to space and time, but I might be referring to some rules that space and time follow. Like I might say something like, well, for space at least, all of the internal angles of a triangle are always add up to 180 degrees. That's a universal rule. If I'm talking about reason's work in a pure sense, one of the ways I can do it is I can just say, like, forget space. Let's just do this analytically. Let's just talk about, like, if I say every triangle's angles need to sum up to 180 degrees. Here's a triangle with angles A, B, and C. What's the sum of angle A, B, and C? All it requires is that you apply this universal rule to this particular case and see that like some conclusion is necessary, that the angles on this triangle are going to add up to 180 degrees. There's something about, too, like, have you guys learned syllogistic logic? Anybody taken Philosophy 115? Learn a little bit of syllogistic logic? That word syllogism means, and it maybe it's a little bit of a clue to what it is that the faculty of reason is up to. That word syllogism means things that are thought together or said together, that if you say the premises or if you think the premises, the conclusion has to come along for the ride. So a syllogism like, all humans are mortal, Adam's a human, therefore Adam's are mortal. Like, yeah, like you can't not have that conclusion if you've got those two premises. They have to all come together. So doing logic is a way, this is one way that Kant is describing this as the activity of reason as this kind of unifying activity of bringing things together. And applications of universal rules seem like they're maybe nothing more than an exercise of logic. We can maybe even think about, these are kind of like all of the ways that kind of like analysis, conceptual analysis. Or, as Hume referred to it, this is just relations between ideas. And this is one way of reason operating in a pure way that's relatively harmless. It doesn't get itself into any trouble. Because when it's doing syllogistic logic, when it's just doing exercises in a logic class, when it's just spinning out the consequences of, like, if there was this universal rule, and if we had this particular case that fit the universal rule, then we should apply the universal rule to the particular case. Just spinning that out in a sort of a hypothetical way doesn't assume any sorts of objects. It's just playing around with the relationships between symbols. But this is incredibly powerful, both in the way that it operates on experience and in the way that I can put it to slightly different work. And not just that I can put it to slightly different work, I can't help beginning to put it to slightly different work. One of the things that pure reason begins to produce here requires me to turn the page in my notes. Pure reason begins to produce transcendental ideas. Notice, by the way, that this is the first time that I've used the word idea in talking about Kant. I haven't mentioned it just yet. We talked about ideas before. John Locke talked about innate ideas and whether or not there were any innate ideas. Descartes certainly talked about ideas as if some of them were innate. Hume said, I think John Locke got suckered into like a silly discussion about whether or not ideas are innate. We're finally talking about ideas now. And Kant reserves ideas for something very specific. Ideas are something that's produced by reason, by pure reason. These are like the pure concepts, but not of the understanding. We had pure concepts of the understanding over here. Now we have, these are something that are more like pure, and I'll put it in quotes because I don't want to confuse the concepts of the understanding with what's going on here in reason. These are pure concepts of reason. And one way that we can kind of keep track of that is to not call them concepts at all, just call them ideas. And specifically, these are transcendental ideas. When I talk about transcendental ideas, this is, what am I doing? Transcendental. Yeah. Transcendental ideas. What I'm doing when I'm coming up with these transcendental ideas is I'm reaching beyond experience. This is like the ultimate move in unifying and completing experience, by the way, is to go beyond what's actually given to me in experience and say, there is some transcendental object, not immanent, not something that I have available to me, not something like experience, which is right here in phenomena, but I'm going to reach beyond that experience to something behind that experience, perhaps to the noumena, to the things in themselves, in order to come up with some sort of idea that like tries to kind of launch me over. This is the whole transcendental part, right? It's not immanent. It's not right here that I can touch. It's beyond what I can actually touch. Trying to get to something transcendent. And pure reason is pushing me to do this. And it's not even wrong that pure reason pushes me to do this. But I can fuck this up. And in fact, I do. And in fact, all of us does. And in fact, it seems to be inevitable. And as a matter of fact, Kant says, in attending to the activities of reason and attending to like what pure reason looks like, what we're going to see is we're going to trace the boundaries of what pure reason is possible. And we're going to find those boundaries by looking at all the places where pure reason reaches beyond what it can actually do very well. This, it does just fine. It does this part just fine. It even does this part just fine. This part starts to get us into dicey territory. There are three major transcendental ideas that Kant talks about, and they're worth at least two of them are worth looking at. The third one's a little bit goofy. And we'll talk about like how those work well and how they start to get us into trouble. So there's a psychological idea. There's a cosmological idea. And there's a theological idea. The psychological idea, which is this kind of like this reaching beyond experience in the sort of way that reason seems to push me to do, to like unify and complete experience. To unify and complete experience by reaching beyond what's available to me and finding some transcendent thing. For my psychological idea, it's the what is that? It's the transcendental ego, or the transcendental self. We talked about this a little bit at our last meeting. It's this idea of an experiencing subject that unifies all experience. That all of those experiences are part of one subject's life, right? It's not a whole bunch of different experiences. It's one experience that's built up out of all of the experiences, smushed together over time. It's in making yourself one thing, you make all of your experiences hang together. Does that make sense? Except, this can't be a thing in itself. That's off limits. Nor is the transcendental self or the transcendental ego, nor is it an object of experience. It's not the sort of thing, I have experiences, and from those experiences when I start wondering, like, all right, so what are the possible ways that I can unify these experiences? What are the necessary conditions for these experiences? I suppose there has to be a thinker of the thoughts, etc., etc., etc. And this leads me to thinking about some transcendental ego as if it were some sort of thing. But it's not a thing. This is actually relatively important. Kant is very, very careful to say that, like, this is an idea that, like, we're bound to come up with. Reason pushes us in this direction and says, you got to come up with this idea of a transcendental ego. But it's not a thing. It's not an object of experience. You never encounter it in experience. It is, at best, a regulative ideal. Plays a regulative role in organizing your experiences such that, like, you start thinking to yourself, like, well, all of these experiences hang together by virtue of the fact that, like, they're all my experiences. I'm just one experiencing subject. That kind of brings everything together. That's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is talking about a cosmological idea, which is a unity not in me, the experiencing subject, a unity in that stuff out there. Maybe this starts to get towards whatever the question mark over there in the noumena is, usually refers to the cosmological idea as the idea of the world in its totality. The world in its totality, no longer made up of daffodils and trees, because we're smarter than that now, right? There's just the noumena. There's just like the totality of all of the objects of possible experience, right? This is maybe another way of thinking about nature, as Kant described it in our previous section. So the world in its totality is also one thing, but I never experience the world in its totality. I only experience the world in, like, fragmentary objects of experience, right? I experience daffodils. I experience trees. I experience a kiss on the cheek. But I don't experience the world in its totality. This is an idea that I come to that pure reason pushes me into to kind of say, like, keep completing experience, keep unifying experience. Or, well, one way to arrive at this is to eventually come to this cosmological idea, which is doing this work of reason. It's kind of operating according to the activities of this faculty of the mind, not this faculty of the mind. The understanding subsumes intuition under concepts and carves the world up. It's reason that's trying to unify everything together. And so what it comes up with plays a different role, has a different function, and behaves a different way. So we got the transcendental ego, we've got the world in its entirety, the cosmological idea. The theological idea is the idea of a perfect being, a.k.a. God. And we got our hands full with enough stuff without even blinking another eye at the theological idea. That's the third of the three that he talks about, and the first two give us plenty to deal with. So as long as you understand that these are just ideas, these are if you want to call them concepts, they're things kind of like concepts, but they work for pure reason instead of the pure understanding. That these are just ideas and they don't refer to any objects, you'll be fine. As long as you recognize that, like, these are the ideas that exist at the limits of what pure reason can do, and kind of get everything like, and there's this idea of the transcendental ego. If that's where you stop, then reason will operate in exactly the way that it should, and it won't get itself into any kinds of crazy problems. On the other hand, if you confuse these ideas with actual objects, if you confuse these with things that are experienced, things that come to you in experience, if you confuse these, if you want to, like the worst possible thing you can do is you can confuse those ideas with referring to things in themselves, referring to like noumena. And they do seem to be pointing kind of towards something noumena. In fact, the very idea of noumena that at the, like we've been able to say at this point, like at best we can just pop a little question mark underneath it. I don't even know if there are daffodils out there. This seems to be the work of some sort of activity of pure reason that's pushing me towards transcendental ideas. And so as long as the role that those play are just kind of like part of me understanding what the necessary conditions for experience are, then I'm fine. If I start thinking of them as actual objects, I enter into what Kant refers to as transcendental illusion. And this is where all hell breaks loose. And this is where a critique of metaphysics is required. This is where a critique of pure reason is required. This is where David Hume was right. That like a lot of this stuff that gets peddled around as if it were metaphysics, a lot of that stuff that David Hume says, consign it then to the flames because it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. A lot of the stuff that comes from a sort of a rationalist attitude towards epistemology and metaphysics that says whatever our minds can come up with, so long as it seems inevitable, so long as it seems like it's got to be the truth, so long as I can't imagine things otherwise, so long as it's illuminated by the natural light and it's clear and distinct, or what was the other phrasing that we used? Not clear and distinct, but vivid and clear. Yeah, vivid and clear. All of these things that the rationalists seem to be saying, like, this is like the sort of knowledge that rational faculties can produce. Forget about empirical faculties. Just think about the rational ones. Kant says, absolutely not. Most of that stuff is total garbage because it commits this transcendental illusion. It mistakes these transcendental ideas for things that are things in themselves at worst, objects of experience at best, but in reality, they're neither. They're just ideas that are produced by this faculty of our minds that has a regulative role in unifying all of our experiences and streamlining our concepts such that they're as efficient as possible. And if you want proof for just like how badly we can screw ourselves over by committing these transcendental illusions or by falling prey to transcendental illusion, we can look at some of the discussions that he offers for the trouble that we get ourselves into. Absent from the Prolegomena, I believe, but definitely in the Critique of Pure Reason, there's a discussion of the paralogisms of rational psychology. The paralogisms of rational psychology, we can kind of recognize he's talking about rational psychology. These have to do with the psychological idea and committing this transcendental or falling prey to transcendental illusion with respect to the transcendental ego. The paralogisms of rational psychology involve a whole bunch of statements that like people seem to want to make about the soul. And Kant says, you can't make any of these statements about the soul because to do so would be thinking about it as if it were an object of experience at best, a thing in itself at worst. And it's neither. This transcendental ego it's a projection of like, if we took this unifying thing to its logical conclusion with respect to like the subject of experience, this is where it goes. It goes to the transcendental ego. And you can think of this, by the way, as like myself, the transcendental ego as like one individual self. But plenty of Kant's contemporaries and successors tried to kind of like stretch that idea a little bit more. Hegel notably said, like, why stop at like one individual self? This can just be philosophical consciousness as such. This is like the whole of human spirit can be an expression of like the transcendental self. Paralogisms of rational psychology, Kant says, these correspond to all of our four categories that we've been looking at before. So the soul is a substance that's supposed to be an expression of relation. It's simple in its quality. It has a unity over time that has to do with its quantity. And in relation to, in relation to possible objects makes it look like it's a relation, but it's about the possible objects in space. He says, this is now a modal aspect. And these are four things that people try to say about the soul. And every single one of them is just nonsense. Because this tries to treat this like it's this. And it's not. Things are getting really complicated now. I can tell, like the jaws are getting slack, the eyes are getting glazed. What we're talking about here is like what the limits of rationality can accomplish. Or like what rationality can accomplish while staying within its limits. Kant is saying if we understand what it is that reason is supposed to be doing, we'll understand how it's working well with respect to experience, but we're also going to find all of its boundaries. And here, we just found it. This whole collection of statements about the self that people want to make, like, none of them are the sorts of things that make any sense. And if you think about what reason is capable of, if you think about how it is that experience is constituted, if you have heeded all of the lessons of this critical philosophy so far, then you'll recognize that I can't treat the transcendental self as if it's a thing in itself. I can't treat it like it's an object of experience because I never have an experience of myself. Is that fair enough? I have an experience of other things, and from that, I somehow infer that I have a self. And it's not bad that I do this. Kant is saying, like, this is the natural trajectory of reason, is that you're going to go from saying, like, I have experiences, therefore there must be an experiencer of the experiences, there must be a self. But we have to recognize that you never experience the self. Just like you never experience completely empty space or time either. You experience things in time. You have experiences of objects in space and in time. You have experiences of experience. I guess, like, yeah. When you have an experience, you're having an experience of some object. And yourself is never that object. It's the thing that's having the experience. And what a weird hall of mirrors that would look like if you did start to experience your thinking self as an object of your experience. Right? It would just like, it would break. And Kant is saying, like, that's the point. This concept is not designed to do that work. You can't take the transcendental ego as an object of experience. When you do, it starts to like get all weird, and reason breaks itself. This is the limits of pure reason. It can't do this. It can only recognize that there's a regulative ideal that we're kind of like pushed towards. Same with the world in its totality. This you do get in the Prolegomena. You get a discussion of the cosmological idea and how it gives rise to the antinomies of pure reason. Kant is doing a similar sort of thing here for issues with falling prey to transcendental illusion with respect to the cosmological idea. This time, though, instead of a bunch of statements that he says make no sense, what Kant shows us is here's a statement and here's its opposite, and both of them look equally plausible. And in fact, both of them can be equally well argued for. And in fact, many metaphysicians for many, many moons, for like centuries and centuries, philosophers have tried to sort this shit out. And they were just completely wasting their time at best. At worst, they were confusing what it is that metaphysics can do and what it does well. The world has a spatio-temporal beginning versus the world is infinite. What do you think? Does the universe have a beginning? Doesn't everything have to have a beginning? That is the best possible answer. Kant says, how am I supposed to know? None of us can know this. None of us could possibly know this, and reason is no help on this question. Reason gives me this one just as well as it gives me this one. And the mistake that I'm falling prey to is I'm thinking of the world in its totality as if it were an object of experience at best. Maybe I'm thinking of it as like the things in themselves, but neither one of those is really an option for the world in its totality. And again, I never experience the world in its totality, just like I never experience myself. The world in its totality is this kind of like projection of like the ultimate culmination of the unification of experience. Yeah, Corinne.
I don't know if you know anything about this, but isn't that what they were trying to prove when they created that? It was like this huge machine that basically flies through atoms and simulated the Big Bang.
Yeah. That was trying to figure out like what's going on in particle physics at the very high energy levels that would have been present at the Big Bang. Yeah.
So that's completely different.
So that's different. Like the Big Bang is a is a theoretical hypothesis that best explains why we can observe what we observe now, which include things like everything in the universe seems to be going away from everything else, right? If you track their movements, they're all going away from each other. It's like, what would possibly explain this? Well, if a long, long time ago there was a boom, and like everything started off in one place and it just kind of exploded, that's one way that things would look the way that they are now. What happened before the Big Bang, though? Isn't this a sensible question to ask? Is there a before the Big Bang? Jack says, no. I think if you can say, like, what happened before today, you can keep asking that question forever. And if, like you say, today the Big Bang happened, you're like, what happened before that? Well, I don't know. Like, does the world have a beginning, just like everything in the world seems to have a beginning and an end, right? So why not the world itself? Or is the world the sort of thing that's infinite? Does everything consist of simple parts? Or is everything a composite? Are you made of parts? Can we break those parts apart? How about those parts? Can we break those apart? Can we keep doing that for as long as we like? Atoms, which literally means uncuttable, atomos. Atoms have no parts, except for protons, neutrons, and electrons. They do too have parts. We got too hasty when we named them atoms. So even atoms have parts. What about the parts of those parts? Do they have parts? Do electrons have parts? I'm not aware of any theory of parts of electrons. I don't know if anybody else knows this. I know protons and neutrons supposedly have parts. Quarks. Each of them is made up of 3 quarks. What about those? Do those have parts? I don't know. This, like, I can try to apply pure reason to this, right? I can keep doing experimental science, which Kant would be like, yeah, keep doing that. Apply this desire to, like, figure out, like, what are the smallest parts. That's good. That is a good instinct that is going to get you to explore the world and make sense of it in a pretty coherent way. To say, whenever I see something and I notice, oh, it's got parts, try to figure out what the parts of the parts are. And keep doing that. As much as you can, you'll learn more about the world that way. But if we wonder, like, is it parts all the way down, or is there a smallest uncuttable part at the bottom of all this? Kant says, like, well, unless experience gives you an answer on this, and I don't see how it could, you can get down to the smallest thing I can cut so far. But as we figured out with the atom, what we thought was uncuttable was just hard to cut, right? So yeah, this doesn't make sense either. Free will versus determinism. Kant says, like, free will is a cause in the world. It's a kind of cause in the world. Or it's not a kind of cause, and the only kinds of causes are those causes that, like, the kinds of natural causes that make markers fly through the air, like any other sort of projectile motion, right? So is free will a cause, or is there not that certain kind of cause? And Kant says, like, no, nobody can answer this. And it's because of this transcendental illusion, which can be recognized, but never completely dissolved. Ottfried Hoffa has an interesting thing to say about this. He says, it's like the illusion of a stick. Have you ever seen a stick in water? And like when you put a stick in water, like here's the water, and here the stick goes into the water, what happens? Yeah, it looks like it's crooked right where it goes into the water. Now, if you've taken a little bit of physics, you know that, like, this is because the refractive index of the water and the refractive index of the air are different. So, like, light gets bent at the interface between the air and water. And it only looks like the stick is crooked. The stick isn't actually crooked. This is an optical illusion. Knowing how it works, does that stop you from seeing the stick as crooked? Nope, it does not. It's the same as any kind of optical illusion. Knowing that it's an illusion does not stop it from appearing as if that way. And Kant says, yeah, this is pretty much what transcendental illusion is all about. Like, the way that reason works throws us into transcendental illusion and what we can do as metaphysicians, like what metaphysics is possible of. Is metaphysics possible? Yes, it is possible. It is the identification of all of these synthetic a priori that we've been doing all throughout. But here, we ended up with 3 really peculiar ideas that have historically been the purview of metaphysics. And Kant says, getting up to those ideas is where it stops. That's the end of metaphysics. You try to go beyond that, you fall prey to transcendental illusion. And that's what the critique of pure reason is all about. That's why they call it the critique of pure reason. And we're out of time now. And that's Kant in a nutshell, in 4 mighty big nutshells. It's a feast for the mind. It's not easy, but maybe right. Definitely a workout, right? I think Kant was one of the first philosophers that when I was reading him, I was like, I'm desperately trying to keep up with what, I was just kind of like, I don't even know what you're talking about. I'm trying to think with you, and you're faster than I am at this. All right. No class on Thursday. We're going to be pushing back the exam. I'll talk more about that in an announcement. Enjoy your spring break. And, take it easy.